What is the one right that no one can ever take from you? Most of us think we know what human rights are: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to live without fear of harm or oppression. But consider this. Every one of those rights, precious though they are, can be stripped away by force, erased by politics, or quietly dissolved by social neglect. Each depends upon conditions outside ourselves. But what if there is a right that doesn't depend on external validation, social agreement, or political permission? What if the most essential human right, one truly fundamental to our existence, could never be touched by any power or taken by any force? Today, I'd like to invite you to explore precisely that possibility. Together, we'll reconsider the very foundations of what it means to have a right. Instead of viewing rights as permissions granted from without, we'll examine rights as capacities arising from within. At the heart of this exploration is what I suggest is the single most foundational right of all: the right to love. Not just romantic love, but the deepest, fullest expression of human care, intentionality, and connectedness. Love, understood as an inner freedom that no institution can grant you and no authority can revoke. This reframing isn't just philosophical, it profoundly affects our psychological health and personal agency. Imagine the sense of empowerment and clarity we gain when we realize that our ability to love is truly uncoercible. Imagine the resilience we build when we recognize this fundamental human power within ourselves. In our time together today, we'll unpack this idea through a careful, structured model, a triadic analysis exploring how the right to love emerges intrinsically from our being, how it shapes the way we understand and interact with the world, and how recognizing it as fundamental shifts our approach to freedom itself. This isn't simply about rights. It's about reclaiming something deeply true about who you are, something nobody gave you, something nobody can ever take away. Let's discover this together. Most of us inherit a certain way of thinking about rights. We're taught that rights are things we have because society has agreed to give them to us, written down in constitutions, enforced through laws, debated in courts. These are what we call constructed rights. They come into existence through human agreement. They're real, but they're also fragile. A right that can be written down can be crossed out. A second category includes rights that are contingent, not necessarily written in law, but shaped by social and political conditions. These might be the freedoms we enjoy in relatively stable societies, like the ability to express ourselves or gather in protest. But these too are subject to erosion. Change the political climate, and these rights can vanish. But is that really all there is to a right? We propose a third category: intrinsic rights, rights that emerge not from institutions or customs, but from what it means to be a conscious, feeling, choosing human being. These are ontological rights. They don't depend on being granted because they arise from the nature of who we are. To clarify this distinction, consider three modes by which rights can be denied. Some are prohibited from being denied. Think of legal protections that say, you may not restrict this. Others are prevented from being denied through force or threat, but these protections can fail. But an impossible denial is something altogether different. It means that the denial itself is incoherent. It violates the very nature of what's being denied. This is where we locate the right to love. Not because it's protected, not because it's allowed, but because it cannot, in principle, be taken from you. No one, no matter how powerful, can reach inside you and extinguish your capacity to love. You may be punished for expressing it. You may be silenced, exiled, or even tortured. But love, real, internal, authentic love, remains yours. Not because of what society says, but because of what you are. This ontological shift is the cornerstone of our model. It calls us to stop thinking about rights as permissions we request, and start recognizing them as powers we already possess. Let's explore this power more closely. What is love in the sense we're speaking of here? Not just romance or affection, not even just the desire for connection. We're talking about love as a volitional capacity, the internal ability to care, to commit, to affirm the value of another being. And when we analyze this capacity, we see that it has three crucial features. First, internality. Love arises from within you. It's not implanted or commanded. It wells up from your own perspective, your own lived experience. Even when it's shaped by another's presence, the experience of loving is yours alone. That's why, even in total isolation or under intense oppression, people still report loving their children, their memories, their ideals. Second, volitionality. Love is not purely instinctual. You can't be forced to love. You may act in loving ways for fear or duty, but feeling love cannot be commanded, nor can it be fully stopped. Even when we try not to love someone because it's difficult, painful, or dangerous, love can persist. In this way, love is an expression of deep inner freedom. And third, irreducibility. Love cannot be reduced to behavior, chemicals, or evolutionary function. It can be modeled, explained, imitated, but never fully captured. You know this when you've been on the receiving end of fake affection. The gestures are there, but something's missing. What's missing is the authentic subjective presence of love. Now consider the limits of external interference. Love can be simulated. We can pretend. It can be suppressed. We can hide it, deny it, fear it. But it is ultimately unreachable. No law, punishment, or social force can reach into the interior of your heart and erase your capacity to love. Think of the resilience this implies. In concentration camps, people continued to love. In solitary confinement, parents imagined their children and felt devotion. In the face of injustice, many have chosen to love their enemies, not out of passivity, but from a deep, unshakable inner strength. This is why we say the right to love is inalienable, because it's not something we do under permission. It's something we are always capable of by the very fact of being human. So far, we've spoken of love as a capacity and a right. But what if love is also a way of knowing? We tend to privilege thought, cognition, as the foundation of knowledge. Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am." But what if that's not the full story? Let's consider a triad of ways of knowing. First, there is thinking, the rational, analytical mind. It's precise, systematic, powerful, but it can be cold. It doesn't tell you what matters, only what is. Second, there is valuing, the capacity to care. Before we reason about what to do, we feel what is meaningful. We don't seek knowledge neutrally, we seek it because we care. This caring directs our attention, frames our priorities, shapes our understanding. And third, there is loving, which combines knowing and valuing into a profound openness. When we love, we don't just observe reality, we enter into relation with it. Love commits us, involves us, makes us vulnerable. It's not detached knowledge, it's participatory. This is more than poetry. Neuroscience now supports the idea that emotion shapes perception and cognition. We don't learn about the world through thought alone, we engage it through feeling. And love is perhaps the most comprehensive and generative of feelings. But this understanding is under threat. The modern world often tries to reduce our inner life. The mechanistic view sees us as machines, input, output, no mystery. The behaviorist view reduces love to reinforcement patterns, just dopamine and training. The objectivist view dismisses anything that can't be measured, as though what we feel inside isn't real unless it's visible on a scan. But none of these can account for what love really is. Ask yourself, when have you felt that someone truly saw you, not just as a function or a label, but as a full person? That feeling comes from love. And when you offer that presence to someone else, you're not just relating, you're knowing them in a way no algorithm ever could. This is why love is not just a right, it's a foundation for how we experience and understand reality. It is a radical form of knowing with, rather than knowing about. Now that we've grounded the right to love as an inner capacity, uncoercible, self-originated, and foundational to knowing, it's time to ask, how does this compare to other rights we commonly talk about? We live in a world where rights are everywhere. Rights to privacy, to healthcare, to education, to expression. These are all deeply important, but they are not all the same. If we're going to think clearly about human rights, we need a way to distinguish between what's truly fundamental and what is socially or politically contingent. So let's consider three categories. First, there are revocable rights. These are entirely constructed. You have them because someone says you do, and they can be taken away just as easily. Think of things like driving privileges or regulatory protections. Valuable, yes. Fundamental, no. Second, we have enforceable rights. These are more robust, like the right to vote or to own property. They're often enshrined in law and supported by institutions. But still, they're dependent. Remove the legal or social structure, and the right loses its force. You may believe in it, but belief alone can't guarantee its reality. And then there are uncoercible rights, and this is where our model takes root. These are the rights that exist regardless of recognition, enforcement, or power. They don't depend on society because they originate in the structure of subjectivity itself. Here, we return to love. Love doesn't require permission. It doesn't rely on institutional support. It can't be revoked by decree. And crucially, its denial is not even coherent in the deepest sense. You can no more deny a person's right to love than you can deny their capacity to think or to feel. You can suppress the expression, yes, but the capacity, it's beyond your reach. This becomes especially important when we test the ontological status of a given right. Some rights are removable, cut them off, and they're gone. Others are suppressible. They can be blocked or minimized, but they still depend on external conditions. But a truly inviolable right is one that cannot be taken, not because of legal defense, but because of existential structure. This gives us a minimalist but powerful standard. If a right can be removed, it is not fundamental. If it can be suppressed, it may be important, but it is not inalienable. But if it cannot even be meaningfully denied, then and only then do we have a truly natural human right. And by this standard, the right to love stands not just among the most important, but perhaps as the most foundational right we possess. Of course, no idea about human freedom can go unchallenged. Love, we're told, is messy, unpredictable, not always noble. Can we really treat it as a universal good, let alone a universal right? To answer these objections, let's look more closely at the nature of love itself. Love begins as an involuntary feeling. It can arise suddenly without warning or logic. You meet someone or remember someone or even see something, a work of art, a cause, a child, and your heart responds. You didn't choose the moment. You didn't manufacture the emotion, it simply arrived. But love doesn't end there. We also have the capacity for willed attention. We choose what we nurture, where we focus our care, how we respond to those initial stirrings. You might feel affection for a stranger, but love grows only when you feed it with time, presence, and choice. And then there's sustained devotion, the long arc of love. Not just the feeling, not just the choice, but the commitment. This is the form of love that persists through hardship, through doubt, through the erosion of initial excitement. This is the love that parents show their children, that partners show one another, that people show to the vulnerable, the forgotten, the difficult. All three of these, feeling, attention, and devotion, make up what we mean by love. And they help us see how love can be spontaneous and volitional, fragile and resilient, a gift and a responsibility. But with freedom comes risk. That's the nature of any truly inalienable capacity. Love can be misused, twisted into control or obsession. It can become ambiguous, driven by unconscious needs, hidden fears, unresolved wounds. And yes, it can even be destructive, hurting ourselves or others in the name of care. These are not flaws in love. They are the price of freedom. To be truly free means that your love is real, not programmed, and anything real carries risk. But would we give up love to avoid its dangers? Would we trade our most vital freedom for safety? Most of us intuitively say no. Because the capacity to love is not just one freedom among others, it's the freedom that gives our other freedoms meaning. So where does this all leave us? Let's bring the whole model into focus with 3 core affirmations. First, the right to love is uncoercible. It cannot be forced into being and it cannot be erased. No matter the circumstances, your inner capacity to love remains yours. Second, it is self-originated. Love arises from within. It is not granted by society, not installed by nature like a reflex, and not imposed by external scripts. It is the expression of your subjective freedom. And third, love is epistemic. It is a mode of knowing. To love is not merely to feel, but to understand, to attend, to perceive with depth and presence. It is a way of relating to the world that brings meaning and clarity, not in spite of its emotionality, but because of it. And this brings us to the final implications for our understanding of human nature. We are, first and foremost, non-objectifiable. You are not a sum of data points. You are not a machine, a pattern, a profile. You are a living, breathing center of perspective, capable of care, and that makes you irreducible. You are also pre-legal. Your rights do not begin when someone writes them down. They do not end when institutions fail. The law may recognize your rights, but it does not create them. And above all, you are radically free, not in the shallow sense of doing whatever you want, but in the deeper sense of possessing the power to choose what you love, to act on your care, to create meaning in a world that cannot give it to you. This is what it means to say the right to love is not just a good idea, it is a truth of being. It is a foundation, it is a model. So what does it actually mean to live this model? It means realizing that your deepest freedoms aren't held in the hands of others. They're not granted by governments, upheld by systems, or negotiated through debate. They live in you, always have. To live this model is to understand that the most foundational human right isn't about what you can do under the law, it's about what you are at the core of your being. And what you are is someone who can love. Even when you've been silenced, you can love. Even when you're powerless, you can love. Even when you've been stripped of recognition, belonging, or safety, you still have this capacity, and that changes everything. Because when we stop treating rights as external permissions and start recognizing them as intrinsic powers, we shift the terrain of our freedom from something that must be defended from the outside to something that must be reclaimed from within. This model tells us your freedom begins not with action, but with awareness. It begins the moment you realize that no one can touch the space within you where love arises. And from that space, inner, quiet, untouchable, your life radiates outward. This is not a denial of injustice. On the contrary, it reveals why injustice hurts so much, because it attempts to distort or suppress what cannot truly be taken. It teaches us why resistance matters, not just politically, but existentially. Living this model invites you to reimagine what strength looks like. It's not just in asserting your rights in the public square, it's in affirming your inner sovereignty over what you feel, what you value, what you choose to give your heart to. It asks you to see others differently too. Not as problems to be solved or roles to be filled, but as beings who, like you, carry within them an irreducible power to love. It's what makes them human. It's what makes you human. And so the right to love isn't simply one right among many. It's the root of all others. It's the beginning of meaning. It's the structure of our freedom. This is not a theory to memorize. It's a truth to inhabit. So live it. Remember, in your hardest moments, that your capacity to love cannot be taken. Affirm it in others. Build from it. Speak from it. Resist from it. Heal from it. And let it be the place where your freedom and your life begin.